So the oil companies were adamant that they needed to get rid of separate accounting. What their argument was, we need stability in our tax structure. And, what I've learned, and I think a lot of others learned, is stability to them is when they're benefiting. If they're not benefiting, stability is not important. They need a change. So after the coup, separate accounting was repealed. And, we've lost billions of dollars as a result of that. And I just keep thinking that if we would have been able to stop that, there would have been plenty of money to fund education, plenty of money to take care of other needed programs and services. Probably met the statutory formula of 50% for a dividend, right? And when we had separate accounting in place, the federal government was getting 36% of the revenues, the oil companies 34%, and the state 30%. So we were still at the bottom of the list. Governor Hammond said, it may not be quite fair, but it's close enough. And that's all I think that we are asking for. Give us a fair share.
Welcome to the East Anchorage Book Club. I'm your host, Andrew Gray. The purpose of this podcast is to tell the stories of Alaskans of interest and importance. Today, our guest is former Senator and Speaker of the Alaska State House, Jim Duncan. He had moved to Sitka to attend Sheldon Jackson College, where he earned his associate's degree in 1962. After earning his bachelor's degree from Illinois State University, he returned to Alaska as a school teacher. He first got involved in politics by serving on the Juneau Assembly. He then served in the legislature for 24 years, 12 years in each body, and had over 70 bills pass into law. We talk about some of his most significant legislation today, including his bills to grow the permanent fund, establish the mental health trust, and to allow teachers and school employees to go on strike. We also talk about his unsuccessful but valiant effort to establish a single-payer healthcare plan in Alaska. What Jim may be most remembered for by history is his losing of his speakership in a dramatic coup that occurred on the House floor in 1981. All of the stories today are covered vividly in Jim's book, Making Sausage, including the events that led to the coup and what motivated them. After leaving the legislature, Jim served as Commissioner of Administration for Governor Tony Knowles. He then led the Alaska State Employees Association as their director from 2003 until 2017. Jim Duncan, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, I'm so grateful to have you here. 24 years in the legislature, over 70 bills passed, just an amazing legacy. And I'm so grateful for your book, Making Sausage. I thought we'd just start by talking about when the idea for writing the book came to you and how you went about it.
Okay. Well, it slowly evolved. Once you're in politics, you can never really leave, as you probably understand. And so even though I was out of the legislature, I continued to work with the Knowles administration and then with the union for 15 years. But I was always focusing on what was correct as far as public policy goes. And I continued to discuss those issues and really was getting discouraged, thinking, wow, some of these things are being overlooked. I'm not quite sure that everyone understands the history and what happened in the past. So I was encouraged to do a little writing about it. Didn't start out with the intention to write a book, but that's what it ended up. As I say in the introduction, it's my memoir. It's about history, but it's not ancient history, because the issues I worked on when I was in the legislature and subsequent to that are still before the legislature today. I mean, they're still current issues.
100%. Hey, will you go to page 209 in the book? Because this is a chapter that's talking about you teaching at the University of Alaska Southeast while you were in the legislature. And you talked about the value of working as a professor while you were in the legislature. But this paragraph at the very bottom of page 209 going into page 210, will you just read that paragraph?
Unfortunately, I think that as years have passed, many elected officials don't understand why policy decisions are made in the early years of statehood. If I could require one thing, it would be that all new legislators should be required to study the state's early development and why legislatures made certain policy decisions before them. It would serve them and their constituents well.
I think that's 100% accurate. And, your book is actually covering mid 70s to early 2000s. And that's not early statehood, but yet I needed that history so much because there are so many things that I thought were new issues, but they absolutely weren't. And I think one of the most shocking one is if you just go to page 212 and read the paragraph at the bottom.
Okay. The failure to adequately fund the public school system became a major issue for me in the 1980s. In my address to NEA Alaska in August of 1988, I said, quote, "It was clear that we, the legislature, had failed to provide adequate funding for education for several years," end quote. To illustrate this, I pointed out that the appropriation for foundation support was almost $493 million in 1986, but reduced to $413 million in 1988. This drastic reduction in funding happened even though enrollment was steady. The excuse used by many for the decrease in funding was that teachers weren't doing a good job providing quality education, so why pump money into a failing system?
I mean, you could have written that in 2026.
Yes,
Like,
exactly.
And that to me is crazy. And I have to say, it was like a fact check on me because one of my favorite speeches is to talk about how well we were funding education in the 90s and why we had hundreds of teachers applying for single positions. And now we have 0 teachers applying for positions. And I think it also brings a lot more light into how valuable our defined benefit retirement system was, because having a generous defined benefit retirement was definitely helping us keep teachers when we weren't adequately funding the education system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. I think when we did away with the defined benefit retirement system, unfortunately, I wasn't in the legislature when that happened. But that was a real step backward. It really did impact our ability to retain and attract quality teachers.
Hey, I'll just mention it. Since you weren't in the legislature, but you were working for the union. You were definitely in the Capitol. You were definitely following that process. And I'll just mention it because, Bert Stedman, who has resisted any movement to return to a defined benefit retirement system, was integral in removing the defined benefit retirement system in 2006. It's in the book.
Yeah. He was the main advocate in the legislature, for sure. And of course, Governor Murkowski was involved, but it was Bert Stedman who was really the leader in the legislature. And as far as I can tell, he really hasn't changed his viewpoint on the defined benefit system.
It's been consistent.
Yeah, he's been very consistent, even though it's been pointed out that it's had a negative impact on our ability, not just to retain and attract quality teachers, but also first responders and other state employees who are in very critical, public employees who are in very critical positions. So, and the history of how that defined benefit system got repealed is what really is discouraging to me, because if we would have understood, our actuary made a mistake. And I was commissioner of administration at that point and reported to me that the funds were in good shape, but they had made a mistake, recognized it after the fact, but failed to correct it.
Right.
And we lost billions of dollars.
Another key fact that I learned in the book was that Speaker of the House John Harris actually flipped his vote. And he had assured you, as having been somebody who had been a member of and supported by the Teamsters, that he was going to vote no. And then when the bill came back before him, he flipped his vote. And I did not know that. And he works as a lobbyist in the building, and that's relevant history. And I'm glad I learned it from your book.
Yeah. And it was a shock to us. He had committed to me and to my lobbyist, Fate Putman, who you probably know,
yes.
and I'm sure to other union leaders, that he would vote against the repeal. But and he did the first time. But the second time around, when it came back a second time, he flipped his vote and didn't tell any of us that he was going to or give any reason why. It just happened. It was a real shock. And that was the end of the defined benefit system.
Yeah, well, we are just skimming the surface of so many issues that you cover in your book, so many important aspects of history. But let's jump way back. And can you talk about your early life and how you made it to Alaska?
Okay. Well, I grew up in the Midwest on the Mississippi River. I was born in Iowa, but grew up on a small farm in Illinois. It was about 125 acres. And in those days, I was a good enough sized farm to take care of a family. And we operated that farm for a number of years. I went to, after high school, and by the way, it was a pretty rough life on the farm. We didn't have electricity until I was 15 years old, or TV, or indoor plumbing. So it was a pretty rough life. But I went to college for one semester at Northern Illinois University. My brother Paul was teaching at Sheldon Jackson College in Sitka. He and his wife were both in Sitka. She taught Sitka School District, he at Sheldon Jackson. And they asked me if I'd like to come to Alaska for a semester, and because I was kind of discouraged with where I was at, and to live with them and see how I liked Alaska. And so I quickly jumped at that. I came to Alaska, first landed in Sitka, and once I was there, it grew on me real quickly, and I never left except to go back outside for other degrees, other college degrees. But Alaska became my home very quickly.
So your entree into politics from the book was, I think you were going to hear LBJ's vice president, Hubert Humphrey, speak, I think in Juneau.
Yes.
Yeah. You felt that you were profiled by the way you looked by the police. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah, I was always a good Democrat. A Democrat. My parents were, and I grew up being a Democrat. And when I lived in Sitka, because I taught there for a while, also before moving to Juneau, I was involved in Democratic politics there. Coming to Juneau, Hubert Humphrey was going to come to a luncheon and speak. And as I recall, the ticket was $35, which in those days was pretty good money. And I was a young father with 4 children, didn't have that kind of money to spend, but I wanted to see Hubert Humphrey, and I wanted to get a picture. So I went to the Baranoff Hotel, bought a newspaper, and was reading it, leaning up against the desk, reading it. And I thought, pretty well groomed. I had long hair, had a full beard and goatee, but pretty well trimmed up, had on a leather jacket. But I was reading the newspaper, and all of a sudden, I got a tap on the shoulder, and a policeman said, "What are you doing here?" And I said, "Well, I came to see Hubert Humphrey. I couldn't afford a ticket, but I want to get a glimpse of him." He asked me to go over to the wall, away from the desk, and did a quick search of me. Couldn't find anything. And then after that, he asked me to leave the Baranoff Hotel, to get out of the vicinity. And I had to. I didn't argue with him. I just did. But clearly, I think I met the profile of what was happening in Juneau at that time. They were profiling folks, people with long hair, with leather jackets, with maybe beards and mustaches who didn't look the part. They would meet them and give them a blue ticket and send them out of town. So,
and I'm curious because, this was like Hubert Humphrey was LBJ's vice president. There was a lot of anti-Vietnam War sentiment. You probably looked like an anti-Vietnam War protester. Are you sure that it was the Juneau Police Department that was profiling you? Or do you think that there was reason to believe that, like, Hubert Humphrey's team himself didn't want a lot of protests or anything at their event?
Well, I never thought about it that way, but I don't think that's the case. I really think it was the Juneau Police Department based upon their history of what they were doing. And they were causing concern in the community already because, as I said, they would meet people from the Marine Highway System as they got off the ferries, would ask them what their purpose was and what they intended to do. And if it didn't match what they wanted, they would put them back on, give them a blue ticket and send them away. So I think it really did come from the Juneau Police Department.
How did that experience lead to you running for Assembly and eventually for the House?
It told me, that if I wasn't happy with the way things were happening, that I could complain about it or I could try to do something about it. And so I decided on the way home, it was about a 10-mile drive home, that I was going to do something about it. And so I became involved on a local level with what was called the Capital JCs, writing newspaper articles, and then decided that the best way to do it was to get on the Juneau City Borough Assembly, where I would have the ability to question what was happening and take action. And I ran. I gotta say, that's my first election. I lost it. It was pretty close for a young guy who probably was considered to be, by some people, to be anti-establishment, but pretty close. And then the fellow who defeated me resigned. And so Wen Greening, who is the son of Senator Ernest Greening, was on the Assembly, called me to ask me if I would accept the position if I was appointed. I said, sure. It could be a hassle, though. I'm not maybe the favorite of some of the people of the establishment. And he said it won't be a problem, and it wasn't. And so that began my career on the Assembly. The one thing I think that most politicians recognize and understand is that being on a local governing body is a tough job. If you really want to make people angry at you pretty quickly, get on the local governing body, because when you make a decision, they feel the impact of that decision right then, and they're there looking you in the eye, yes or no. So I decided I was enjoying it, but that if I wanted to move on in politics, that I was going to need to move off the assembly, or I should move off the assembly and run for a higher office. And that's why I ran for the House of Representatives.
And my understanding is that your main issue, and actually I think it was an issue for you for decades, but was resisting efforts to move the capital out of Juneau. And particularly in the 70s, I think there was a lot of momentum and talk about relocating the capital to somewhere on the road system, particularly in Willow. Can you talk a little bit about that as a campaign issue and how it affected your first couple of years in the House?
Well, it was a campaign issue, and I knew it was going to be, because depending if the initiative to move the capital passed in the 74 election, which it did, and that was my first election, and I was running against a 10-year incumbent. She had been majority leader under Speaker Tom Fink, and so I was running against her, so it was not going to be an easy task. And the Juneau Empire and the local news media were all saying, it's not time to change. We can't change horses now, right? We got to keep the experience there, or we're in trouble. Well, I was able to make the argument that I was going to be in a leadership position in the House, because it was obvious there was going to be quite a few Democrats elected. I think there was 31 total, and that I would be able to wrangle a seat on the Finance Committee from Speaker Mike Bradner, which I did, and that I could be successful in stopping the capital move, and maybe even more so than what the current incumbent was, because she was tied many times too closely to what Tom Fink and some of the others might want to do, because as majority leader is her position. So I was successful in winning that election, and from there I ran for the House, 12 years total for it, so 5 more times. And then for the Senate after that. It was the start of my career, but it was a capital move, and it was a major issue in that election. And it was a capital move that was a major issue in my first session. And because there was a commission established, required to be established, Governor Havlin appointed them, and they chose Willow as the site for the new capital. And fortunately, there were some other folks around the state who got involved. Bob Bittersworth, Bill Purvis from Juneau, Jim Clark from Juneau, some of these folks who said, look, we need to start talking about how much this is going to cost. And so they put together what they called a Fiscal Responsible Alaskans Needing Knowledge, a Frank Committee, and we were able to get that money figure, get the total dollar figure, to offset just the, you'd like to have a Cadillac, right? But when you go pay for it, it's a little bit too expensive, maybe. So we were able to defeat that on that basis. But that was a major issue then, continued to be. As I say in the book, every year that I was in the legislature, I had to be on my toes, because the capital move was the issue. And there were those who would be after it every time they had an opportunity.
Well, it seems like a heavy lift, because, with so few legislators actually representing Juneau, the 2 reps and the senator, you're outnumbered. There are a lot of folks not from Juneau who are going to be much more open-minded to a move of the capital. So it seems actually really almost unbelievable that Juneau has managed to stop that move for so many decades. But they still talk about it. People still talk about it all the time.
Oh, they talk, sure they do. But I think one of the important issues, one of the important things that we all understood from Juneau is we needed to build good relationships with other people in the state, right? And throughout Southeast Alaska, we need to be sure we were supporting those folks. Fairbanks, same, rural Alaska, and there were people in the Rail Belt that we could work with. And we just needed to continue to work with them, to be as cordial as possible, to help them in any way we could. And Juneau itself really stepped forward and made it many major monetary contributions to make Juneau a better community. So it still hasn't gone away. You're right. We still watch it. I'm watching it from afar now. What's happening is slowly erosion of positions from Juneau elsewhere and major central government positions. And it's not a capital move as such, but you're finding a lot of the government functions have been transferred from the seat of government in Juneau to elsewhere, further headed up. So, and it wasn't always that way. Many governors up through, I think, Governor Murkowski may be the last one to do this, but he required that his commissioner live in Juneau. And they did, and that kept a lot of the positions there. After that, governors such as Palin and some of the others didn't really make that requirement at all. Some of the governors didn't even spend a lot of time in Juneau. For example, current governor Dunleavy spends very little time in Juneau, as far as I can tell. And so that really does lead to the erosion of central state positions from the capital city to elsewhere in the state.
It's interesting because, and I've mentioned this many times on the podcast, that I wasn't very involved in politics until I ran for office the first time, particularly statewide politics. So for me, having only worked in a legislature with Governor Dunleavy, I just assumed that during the interim, Governor Dunleavy has an office in Anchorage. That's where you would meet with him. And his commissioners had offices in Anchorage, and that's where you met with them. And I had never really thought about any time prior where folks might have been doing the business of government in Juneau during the interim, because to me, that was normal. But I guess it's not normal.
Yeah, no, it's not. No, there was a time when most of the business during the interim was done in Juneau. And, I can't recall which representative it was, but someone just recently, a couple of years ago, I guess very jokingly, talked about making the governor's mansion during the interim a bed and breakfast, right? Because nobody was living there.
Oh, yeah. That was actually Will Stapp from Fairbanks. He had a bill to make it a bed and breakfast.
Yes. Yeah. So that's where things have gotten, right? During the interim, the governor, if he's not from Juneau, I expect if the governor's from Juneau, they may stay in Juneau a lot, but they'll also be now, because many positions have moved, be required to be elsewhere in the state a lot also. And for the first time, I think it was Governor Dunleavy who called a special session to meet elsewhere other than in Juneau. And that had never happened before.
Bouncing ahead, you were elected Speaker of the House. Talk about getting elected Speaker of the House and why it was such a tenuous time.
It was a tenuous time. For a long time, we had the record. In 1981, it took us 22 days. But that record was broken by the House several years ago. But the real problem was we had 22 Democrats. That's all we had. And it takes 21 to become the Speaker, of course. We had 22. And we still had the issue of the capital move that was out there. So putting together an organization was very difficult. And I was working with Sam Cotton. Sam and I he wanted to be Speaker. He was trying to be Speaker. I had a rural delegation behind me and some Southeast folks. He had some other people. And so we were for 22 days, just couldn't get it to come together. And when it finally did, we got it together, and Sam became finance chairman, Sam Cotton did, and I became Speaker. Still had to deal with the issue. We only had 22 members. And the statement that was made by then Representative Pat Carney from Wasilla, that he was not going to vote for me because I would do everything I could to stop the capital move as Speaker. And that would mean the capital move was dead. So we only had two.
Did he have Willow in his district? That's what I assumed. But I mean, even if Willow wasn't in his district, I mean, it's close enough.
He was one of the hardcore believers in moving the capital. And I don't know if Willow was in his district or not, but it was close enough. You're right there. But so it ended up I had to bear 21 votes to become Speaker of the House. And so, running an organization when you have those undercurrents going on, and then we had the whole question of oil taxation policy and as a major issue, which the oil companies and many of the Republicans in the Senate and in the House wanted to make a change in oil tax policy, which I wasn't in favor of and my organization wasn't. It was a difficult time, and it just, try as we might, we couldn't keep it together.
Your book does a really good job of explaining how the real issue there was the oil tax policy. And that although, if you just looked at it superficially, it might have seemed more like personalities. But the reality is that there was policy issues that oil companies wanted, and they were going to do everything they could to undermine what was blocking them from getting what they wanted, which was the Democratic majority in the House.
That's correct. They had their sights set on removing me as Speaker and changing the conference committee on the oil tax so that they could get what they wanted. Now, I knew there was problems for a long time. I mean, there was, constant, meeting with people, and people were complaining about various things. And when I finally had a meeting when I knew it was coming to a head, Representative Al Adams and several rural members called me to Representative Adams' office at that time.
Because he was from Kotzebue.
He was from Kotzebue, and he had supported me, had been one of my main supporters in becoming Speaker, and said that he wanted to talk to me about a couple of issues. He had a couple of things he wanted me to consider. One of them was that for some reason, they weren't very happy with Representative Cotton as finance chair. I thought he was doing a good job. They thought he was maybe moving too slowly and wasn't taking care of them enough. But all in all, I thought he was doing a very good job. And the other was oil taxes. And he said to me, there's going to be reorganization. We're going to go ahead with one, but you can remain a speaker if you agree to two things. One would be that you would remove Representative Cotton as finance chair. And the second would be that you change the conference committee on oil taxation by removing a certain member and putting someone else on who is in favor of the changes. Of course, he said, you can think overnight. I said, don't worry, don't bother. I don't need to think overnight. I'm not going to do that. Can't do that. For one, I'd have to have the rest of my caucus behind me. If I was going to do that, I couldn't do it by myself. And I would never consider breaking a commitment to anyone to Representative Cotton in that case. And so he said at that point, that meeting told me, it's not just about being unhappy because they didn't think they're getting enough money. It was really oil taxation, which was a major issue, because that was the major point that was brought up.
Well, it seems like one of the things that the oil companies protested the most was separate accounting. Can you explain what separate accounting was and why they wanted to get rid of it?
Sure. Separate accounting, and they was adamant to get rid of it. In 1977, Governor Hammond introduced some legislation that was going to change the oil and gas production tax. And part of that was to move to separate accounting. Before that, we'd had what we call a modified apportionment approach to taxation. And that's where the oil companies could take, that at that point, most of their revenues were coming from Alaska. Alaska was the golden goose, right? But they could take their expenses elsewhere and offset that against Alaska income and therefore reduce their Alaska tax liability. Separate accounting, which we've passed and was at the heart of this conference committee, we passed separate accounting, which changed that to say you can only offset Alaska expenses against Alaska income. And that increased from the first year when it was passed. It increased their tax liability from $10 million a year to $900 million. And there are people who've looked at this and they say that we've lost billions of dollars over the next decade because of that change away from separate accounting. So the oil companies are adamant that they needed to get back to a modified apportionment, get rid of separate accounting. What they said was, their argument was, we need stability in our tax structure. And what I've learned, and I think a lot of others learned, is stability to them is when they're benefiting. Mm-hmm. If they're not benefiting, stability is not important. They need a change. So after the coup, I had appointed Terry Gardner and Tony Vasca and Pat O'Connell, who was a Republican, to the conference committee. And the Senate had their members. Joe Hayes, who became Speaker, immediately removed Tony Vasca, replaced him with Rick Halford, who was then pro-oil, and that separate accounting was repealed. And, we've lost billions of dollars as a result of that. And I just keep thinking that if we would have been able to stop that, there would have been plenty of money to fund education, plenty of money to take care of other needed programs and services. And we're still fighting that battle today to get what we consider a fair share of our oil revenues.
You also did a really great job of talking about how the folks who scream the loudest that all people in Alaska are owed a very large permanent fund dividend are also the same folks screaming and shouting that whatever we do, we can't raise the tax burden on the oil company. And you point out how there's a definite disconnect there, that on the one hand, they're saying this is our money and it's owed to us. And on the other hand, saying we can't tax the oil companies in order to have that money to pay the dividend.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It doesn't make sense to me, right? They want a larger dividend and maybe deserve a larger dividend. But at the same time, the way where you get the revenues to provide that dividend is from our fair share of the oil revenues. Now, what I like to say, a lot of people think that we're trying to gouge oil companies. I've always taken the position, no, we just want our fair share. And when we had separate accounting in place, the federal government was getting 36% of the revenues, the oil companies 34%, and the state 30%. So we were still at the bottom of the list, but it was fair. Governor Hammond said, it may not be quite fair, but it's close enough. And that's all I think that we are asking for, at least I ask for in the state, is give us a fair share. So
I've tried to talk about the coup before. I'm really grateful for your book because your book has several chapters on it, so I understand the issue so much better. I think I have a couple of questions about the coup that maybe you can explain. So you just mentioned that Joe Hayes became the new Speaker of the House. Joe Hayes was a Republican. But when they, quote unquote, did the coup, they actually made Oral Freeman the Speaker of the House. Oral Freeman was a Democrat. Why did they do that?
I think they were trying to, in some way, placate the Democrats, right? But it was going to be Oral in the organization. A lot of the Democrats were not in. So they gave it to him. They said, we want you to be the Speaker of the House. And I've talked to Oral several times during this whole process, and I relate that in the book. And he always told me, I know nothing about what's going on, nothing's happening, et cetera. But after, Russ Meekins assumed the chair and ran the meeting where they voted me out of the Speaker position, then they said that it was going to be Freeman. He finally declined. And I got to believe the reason he declined, the only reason he declined, is he was preparing to run for governor. And he wanted to run as a Democrat. And so he thought it was in his best interest not to take that for a short-term position, but to, try to keep his name clear. And so when Freeman stepped back, and they weren't interested in having Russ Meekins do it, when Freeman stepped back, they went to Joe Hayes, who seemed to be their next natural person to choose.
So trying to understand Russ Meekins has been a multi-year project for me. I think what I learned most from your book is that I had gotten his chronology wrong. I didn't realize that he had helped with the prosecution of Senator Homan with the bribes having to deal with the capital budget. That happened actually before the coup. And I had always thought that happened after. So I'm wondering if maybe part of what he was doing was trying to get himself back into power because he'd lost some credibility or maybe some trust through the whole Homan issue.
Yeah, well, I've always struggled with that issue also. Why did Russ, because he and I were good friends.
Yeah, and I guess to point out for listeners, Russ Meekins was a Democratic representative from Anchorage who had been part of the majority, and that he was the man who sat in the speaker's chair during the coup and basically acted as the leader of the coup.
Yes, that's a good description. And he and I were good friends. We shared offices. We shared staff members. In the days when you had to share a secretary or a research someone, and we'd work well together. And he was majority leader in my organization. He had wanted to be a finance chair, but he got majority leader instead. So I really don't know. I think it was he just wanted to gain power. I really think that's what he was all about. And it did come. I was on the conference committee on the budget. Russ was chair. I was on the conference committee as the other majority member. And then I forget who the other was. And Homan was on the other side. And that is where he accused, during the conference committee hearings, he accused of George Homan of taking a $10,000 bribe for putting money in for some firefighting planes. And George was convicted. Senator Homan was convicted. And
went to prison.
And went to prison, yeah, and lost his seat. And I don't think that ever set very well with the rural members at all. And it became very obvious after the coup, when the organization was put together, those who were the leaders, such as Russ, didn't fare very well. He got a minority position on judiciary. Freeman didn't get a very good position. And I think the reason that Russ didn't is because there was a lack of trust in him by the rural members. And it could have been, in a way, a payback for what he had done to Homan.
Well, I've talked about this before. I was supposed to have Russ Meekins' sister, Susan Sullivan, on the podcast a few years ago. Unfortunately, she's passed away now. But she ultimately declined to appear because she said that the whole Homan issue just really put a target on her brother, and that he actually left the state forever with his family because of so many threats on them from folks in the Kuskokwim Delta, that there was just a lot of anger and resentment against him for sending Senator Home into prison, and that he didn't think they were ever going to recover.
That may very well be the case. And I could tell there was hard feelings in the legislature about that because he was not a very popular guy for doing that. And did George get $10,000 for doing something? The court side he did. He was found guilty. In those days and age, $10,000 was probably a little bit more than it is today, right? But if you're going to do something like that, you would think it would be for something more beneficial. So anyway, that's what happened, and that may very well be, because I know Russ left. I always wanted to get back together with Russ after some years went by, but he had gone back east and had started his business, and then he unfortunately passed away pretty young also, and so we never had the opportunity to get back together. So I always wanted to sit down and say, Russ, it's all behind us now. Let's talk about what really happened. What was it about?
And I guess that's my second question about the coup. Is you just need 21, right? Why did they have to do like a dramatic, excuse everyone from a call of the House, have Russ Meekins sitting as a speaker pro tem? They could have removed you with all 40 members there and a vote. I mean, why did it have to happen this dramatic way?
Well, that's what amazed me also. You're exactly right. Any time after I called a session to order, during the regular business, someone could have at some point made a motion to remove me as Speaker of the House and taken a vote. And if they had the votes, that's what would have happened. And it could have been done. I wouldn't have been really very pleased probably, but it could have been done in a more responsible way other than a coup where really there was a lot of shouting and back and forth, et cetera, right? It could have been a more controlled approach. So it's one of those things in history. I don't know. I may be the only speaker nationwide who's been removed midterm like that, other than on the federal level now. Speaker
right.
Federal
I would
level
say, like Kevin McCarthy.
Yeah.
But anyway, one last issue about the coup. You pointed it out that it was Russ Meekins plus rural legislators, the Bush caucus.
Right.
And even though, we were about to have an enormous capital budget because there was so much money coming in, there was fear that they weren't going to get their fair share. As though you point out in the book, they were getting more than their fair share, but they wanted more. But you also kind of pointed out that, ironically, by them cutting the oil and gas taxes, that they actually ended up with less revenue in the long run. I guess can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I always thought that was a little bit ironic, and I wasn't sure that they thought that through completely, because when they changed the tax structure, got rid of separate accounting, we lost billions of dollars. They wanted more clout. They wanted to have the clout to get more money into their rural areas of the state. And, I sympathize with them, because rural areas of the state, there's some major problems out there that needed to be taken care of then and still do today. So they wanted more clout to do that. But what I always struggled with was, you got more clout, but you've got less money. So what good does the clout do you if you don't have the money that you can allocate to your areas? Because you still have to take care of the urban areas, Anchorage and Fairbanks and Juneau, elsewhere. And so I'm not clear that they ever thought that out. It was a grab for power all of a sudden. It may not have been well thought out what the result was going to be. And even Joe Hayes found out that to get out of the session after he took control, he had to go into deficit spending. He had to spend from the next year in order to satisfy people. Now, we haven't solved the problem yet as to having adequate revenues to address all the needs, not only in rural Alaska, but in urban Alaska. They're just, they're mounting on us to, the need for reconstruction, for improvements, for maintaining, for maintenance. It just, we have schools falling apart. We have all kinds of issues that need to be addressed. And unfortunately, we aren't in a position to do that right now.
Well, you mentioned him in the book, you mentioned Senator Bill Wielechowski as being very consistent in wanting and he has said the word separate accounting before to me. I didn't really know what he meant. I
Yeah.
learned it from your book, but he has been very consistent in wanting to right this wrong that happened over 40 years ago. And I spoke with Eric Croft on the phone just before I interviewed you, and he brought it up. He's like, well, you got to talk about the coup because we're still dealing with the fallout from the coup today. And by the way, and you quote his dad, Chancey Croft, in the book.
Yeah, I did. Chancey was very much involved in saying, look, when you do away with separate accounting, you've done away with Alaska's ability to really, control its fate. And we're still dealing with that. If we would have not gone away from separate accounting, we would have had enough revenue to address all these issues and probably met the statutory formula of 50% for a dividend, right? And so the folks would be happy there, and we'd be funding education and all the other programs that we need to fund. So it's been what happened 40 years ago. That's why it's not ancient history.
Right.
Because that history is impacting us today and will impact us into the future.
Well, I had Lisa Weisler on the podcast a couple of weeks ago, and she has her book, Capital Crude, that came out last year, which covered a lot of these issues. And I would say if there were a simple thesis to her book, it is that as oil companies made bigger and bigger profits from Alaska, they had more and more money. They felt the need to spend more and more money on elections in Alaska so that they had a tighter control on the legislature. And she points out that with a Senate of only 20 people, you don't have to invest in very many elections in order to control that body in particular.
Yeah, she's exactly right. I quote her in the book, by the way. I referenced one of her papers because she did a very good job. And I think I wrote the book before her book came out. I didn't know that she was going to have that book, but she's done a great job, very intelligent person. But, clearly, it's just one of those things that somehow we've got to get over the hump, and we've got to find some way to get back to where we're getting our fair share and where we get the people to buy into it. Now, it can't be done, Andrew. I think maybe you agree with this. It can't be done by one party alone. This is going to have to be a bipartisan effort. We can't just say the Democrats are going to do it or the Republicans are going to do it, because once you get that stringent, then you've got an ongoing battle. You need to get both sides involved, get them talking, and find areas where you reach consensus and do it on a bipartisan nature. Right. And I think that may come.
Hey, one interesting thing in this section of the book that I had never heard about before, which again, I think speaks more to me just not being well educated and not so much that this is like a secret, but the proposal for creating a 51st state where you would basically have the North Slope and Western Alaska break off and form its own state because they have the resources and that they could fund themselves. And then they would basically leave South Central Alaska and Southeast on their own to fend for themselves without the natural resource. Can you talk a little bit about that proposal and what the discussions were like in the building when that was going around?
Well, there weren't that much, at least as far as I could tell, that much discussion about it. But Andy Edge, who is the state Democratic Party chair, and Mr. Hoffman from the villages out there, they were talking about it's the North Slope and Western Alaska that are providing all the resources, right? Providing the money to the state of Alaska. We'd be better off if we succeeded from the state, created a 51st state, and then we could take care of ourselves and let the rest of Alaska deal with the problems without our revenues. And I think that, I'd say in the book, that's one area where I didn't understand clearly how important it was to those folks to have clout, how much they felt they were being taken advantage of, that they were providing the money and that they needed to get more in return. And that was maybe one of the shortcomings. I'm not afraid to admit that I wasn't perfect as a speaker, no one is, but I overlooked that. And, I quote there, Willie Hensley even said, well, if it was possible, it doesn't sound like a bad idea. It wasn't possible. It wouldn't happen. Tony Bass, a good friend of mine, said the same thing, basically. So it was a very strong feeling in rural Alaska that they were providing the resources, and they still are. The resources are coming from the North Slope, and they want to have more to say in where the money goes. And I
Right.
misjudged that.
Yeah, and actually, I just have to say, because I just had Lisa Weissler on the podcast, I just had Willie Hensley on the podcast, so I basically have 3 historic podcasts in a row with you finishing off the trilogy. I wanted to talk about a few of your pieces of legislation, and I think we'd start by talking about House Bill 28, which was your bill to basically make the permanent fund bigger. Can you talk about that bill and what it became and how you moved it through?
Well, if people were eyeing the undistributed income earnings, right? There was $600 million in that account, and there was pressure. I could hear the pressure from, and not just from rural Alaska, but from urban Alaska, how they wanted to take that money and put it into capital projects or whatever else would benefit them. So I became concerned that that's what we were going to end up doing. And so I introduced House Bill 28, and the requirement was that the undistributed income account couldn't exceed 5% of the principal of the fund. And once it did, anything over that 5% would automatically be distributed into the principal of the fund. And that would take care of inflation proofing, it would take care of dividends, and so on. So that was my idea. It was going to be an automatic transfer from the undistributed income to the principal of the fund. And then the legislature wouldn't be able to touch those. Now, that was going to be done by statute. And of course, anything by statute could be changed. But I knew I didn't have the votes for a constitutional amendment. Some people weren't very happy with that. They weren't happy with the idea it was going to be an automatic transfer. Speaker Ben Grusendorf didn't like that part of the bill. I know that Senator Frank Ferguson didn't. In fact, he more or less threatened me. He said, if Juneau thinks they don't need the money, then they don't need the capital, right? So he brought that issue.
Wasn't he going to use that to say that that's why y'all needed to move the capital? That he was using that to justify moving the capital.
Yeah, that's exactly what he's going to do. Now, I guess he thought maybe I'd back off because of that. But, once someone makes that type of statement, clearly I had no choice but to move ahead. And I made the point that the two don't relate at all. But Senator Bill Ray from Juneau, my colleague, also opposed my idea. But the reason he did it is he wanted to keep friends with Senator Ferguson and some of the others. So it became pretty complicated. And it started off at $315 million that was going to be transferred. And the Senate was a holdup. And they said, no, we're not going to do that. We don't want to move that money. Session adjourned. The bill was still there. They came back into session, and all of a sudden it had new legs. And what had happened is the senators had gone home to Anchorage, elsewhere. Senator Fakes, who was Senate president, actually said, I went home and I found out that 75% of my constituents want that money transferred, right? So they changed their direction real quick. It ended up being
$1.2 billion or something like that.
1.2 billion that was transferred, which is fine with me. It increased it by 600 million or so, which was fine with me. The only thing that didn't happen, and I really hated, I had to give it up, was the automatic transfer of anything over 5%. That idea is still around. It's still being talked about, right?
It's kind of like the POMV draw at 5.25%.
Yes, yeah, basically the same thing. And the real key, to make that work well, would be to have the votes do it as a constitutional amendment. That would be the real key. But that has to be structured pretty carefully. But that would be the key, because once you do it by statute, as you know, the next legislature can change that.
Yeah. Hey, and you mentioned Jan Fakes, president of the Senate. She called you dangerous, and she didn't put you on a conference committee. I guess, can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, she did. I was on the Senate Finance Committee. She was Senate president, and everyone expected I would be one of the Senate conferees, but I wasn't appointed. And oh my goodness, I'm trying to think of the name. The newspaper person, I should know his name. Slipped my mind all of a sudden. Asked her why she didn't appoint me. And she said, well, he's too dangerous, because we know that if we put him on the conference committee, we want to cut the budget, and we won't be able to do it because he knows the budget too well, he'll work it too hard, and we won't be able to get it done. So she said I was too dangerous. So that's what happened. But meanwhile, she forgot about the relationships I had built with Senator John Bickley, for example, and some people on the House side, Pat Rochelle and others, that I could still get what I thought was important. And then at the end of the session, when things were falling apart, she asked me and Senator Joe Josephson to take over negotiations with the House leadership to try to end the session, which we did try to. almost got there. We at least got the budget passed. There are some bills that didn't make it, but we got the budget passed.
I want to talk about Senate Bill 65 and the creation of the Mental Health Trust. This is a really complicated issue. And so I would love for you to explain it in a simple way that everyone can understand.
Well, I'm not sure I can do that very quickly, but at statehood, the feds gave the state 1 million acres of land that was supposed to be managed to the benefit of people with mental health needs. And we had failed to do that. The state was failing in that. And
it was like 1 million acres?
Yeah. That was transferred. And the state had failed to really fulfill their obligation. And, things went along okay for a while. And then a couple of parents of people with mental health issues who needed money filed suit and said the state is not fulfilling the obligation. And that tied up a lot of land in court. And people who had purchased individual residences, for example, all of a sudden found out they couldn't get clear title because it was mental health land.
Right. And they had bought, so they built their home on land they thought was their land and found out later that it was actually mental health trust land and that they didn't own it.
Yeah. And there were quite a few folks like that. And some other major projects. Usability Coal, for example, was another example of where there was problems. So nothing was moving forward on it. And finally, I decided, and, I mentioned in the book, I had to make a decision whether I wanted to work hard to get in leadership positions or just work on major issues. And I decided working major issues is where I wanted to go. I decided that someone in the legislature needed to take leadership on it. I had my staff, we made that our number one priority. We worked with the mental health community during the interim. We had many, many meetings, put together a proposal that they worked on, and that I give them full credit for putting it together. But I was supposed to give them advice and, of course, use my knowledge of the process to get it through. And at the same time, Governor Hickel wanted to do more studies. Nothing was happening from the governor's office. And as you know, if the governor doesn't take leadership, things are just going to not move forward. And there's recent examples of that. You got to have that leadership coming from the governor's office. He didn't move forward. And what they finally said was, well, if anything happens with the mental health issue, it's going to have to be from Duncan's bill because we're not going to get involved in it. What happened was he then introduced a bill pretty similar to mine.
Didn't he do it like with 8 days left?
Yes,
the very end of session.
Very short period of time. And he was going to give credit for it then because that was going to be his bill. The Senate leadership said, well, wait a minute. Governor Hickel didn't do any work on this thing. It was all Duncan. So they did what's very unusual. They took the bill, put it under my name, and because I had done the work on it and my staff had, and we passed the legislation. And it is complicated. The biggest gain out of that right now was the creation of the trust authority itself, the Mental Health Trust Authority itself. It's got the board that oversees what's going on with the mental health services and make recommendations on the budget and what is needed to help mental health beneficiaries. And that I think was one of the biggest wins we got out of that legislation.
Well, and I think just so folks understand why I'm talking about this, when you're a new legislator, one of the things that surprises you is that you have to vote on the mental health budget. So we have the operating budget, we have the capital budget, and we have the mental health budget. And It's just such an interesting thing because you're like, why do we have a mental health budget? Like, why does this entity get its own budget? And it's because of these issues that started decades before.
Yeah. Well, that's exactly the reason why, because in the early years, there was not that third budget. But clearly, there's probably still a whole lot of needs that aren't being met, but a lot better job is being done. And at least, the freezing of land has been lifted so that people can go ahead with their developments and their homes and so on. So, and mental health beneficiaries can receive adequate services.
So speaking of healthcare, moving out of mental health care to just healthcare in general, we all know that the price of Alaska healthcare is very, very high. Sometimes the highest in the country, the United States being the highest in the world. You could argue that Alaska's healthcare is the most expensive in the world. And I think it was, again, talking about how no issue is a new issue. You worked so hard on controlling costs for healthcare. And I was particularly interested in you paying for studies yourself. You wrote that you I commissioned and personally paid for the cost for 3 studies by Solutions for Progress, a Philadelphia firm. And this was looking at the benefits of a single payer healthcare system for Alaska. I guess just before we talk about single payer healthcare in Alaska, can you just talk about how you went about paying for studies to be done? Because I've often thought about that and didn't know how to do it.
Well, you take it out of your pocket, but the cost wasn't nearly as much as it would be nowadays. I'm quite sure. We're talking 30 years ago, so the costs were a lot different. But I was so committed to the issue. Increasing access to healthcare and for people to have coverage was very critical to me. I mean, I can remember, I think I said in the book, growing up on the farm, when that was one of the major issues. My dad was a union member, and they used to negotiate contracts, and the most important thing to them, wages was important, but it was the benefit of finally having an employer-based health insurance plan. That was very critical. Health insurance was always a major issue for me. Senator Johnny Ellis worked with me. The late Senator Ellis, who's a great guy, worked with me on the issue. But I kind of took the lead, and I became committed to the idea that we could do a single payer health system, and it would work. But we had to control cost. In fact, one of the things that surprised me at one point, the Anchorage Times said, "Well, Duncan's got an idea to control costs that probably needs to be done. This may not be the way to do it, but we need to be looking at that very seriously." And so, I just kept at it, commissioned the studies, because there was also the question about how would it interact with the native population, right? Because it had PH health service. So we wanted to be sure everything there was straightened out. And I actually think that we were on the road. They're getting some positive action on it when President Clinton's, if you recall, when he came into office, that was his major issue, and we put Hillary in charge of it, his wife. And when it fell in about a year's time, it took the air out of the balloon on a lot that was happening on the state level. That was unfortunate, because I think if he would have been successful on a federal level, then we could have kept moving on the state level. But there were other ways to address this, and I kept after it. And one of the ways, and unfortunately, we're seeing this being negatively impacted, is the funding for Medicaid. One of the things that I was keeping my eye on what was happening on the federal level was that Ted Kennedy was leading a charge to expand Medicaid for pregnant women and for children who are under Medicaid, to allow it to be spent. And so I introduced legislation to do that. I happened to be in the minority in the Senate at that time, and it didn't pass. But Governor Knowles picked it up the next year, and after 2 years, he got it in place, and that's Denali Kid Care. And it initially covered 10,000 and probably more than that now. But unfortunately, what's happening on a federal level, because of the restrictions on Medicaid funding, is a lot of those folks are going to lose their coverage. And it's unfortunate, but that's kind of the mindset of those who are in charge on the federal level right now, to reduce those types of programs. And Medicaid has been on the chopping block.
What's interesting about this chapter in the book is that you actually reported about the interaction that you had with the lobbyist, Larry Hull. Is that how you say his last name?
Yes. Larry Hull.
And he was the lobbyist for the Alaska Railroad Corporation. And you guys were working on creating an insurance pool, and he did not want the railroad to be included. And I guess, can you talk a little bit about what happened between you and him in the hallway, and then what happened on the floor?
Sure. The bill I was pushing, we were doing, as you said, an expanded pool. We were going to include
SB 254.
Yeah. Okay, SB 254. We're going to include a larger group of people as a purchasing pool. And the larger the group of folks you get, the better premium you should be able to get, the less cost it would be. And so, for some reason, and I was presenting it, the bill was moving pretty well, and I was presenting this at the committee, and Larry Hull testified against the bill. Mm-hmm. And made some statements, which, whether they were correct or not, is neither here nor there. But afterwards, I stopped him in the hallway and said, "Larry, let me tell you, what you said is not correct." And then he implied that I had misled him, or I had lied. I was pretty adamant I wanted that bill to move. That didn't sit well with me, and I said, "Look, I don't appreciate you calling me a liar, and if that's the way you're going to act, you're going to have a tough time down here over the next few years, right?" So he apparently went to Senator Fakes, who was president of the Senate, and complained about saying that I had hollered at him and used profanity or whatever else. And she took the opportunity to chastise me publicly on the floor of the Senate and say that I owed Larry an apology.
Hey, I want to read what she said exactly. So she gave a special order on the floor of the Senate. And by the way, I want to talk about this in a second. This is the Senate president doing a special order, which I think is very unusual. And she accused you of, quote, verbally abusing, intimidating, and threatening Houle, spiced with profanity, and that you would make it your life's ambition to get rid of Mr. Houle and Mr. Frank Turpin, his boss. Which you said was not true, that you never said that you were going to make it your life's ambition to get rid of him.
No.
But she said that in her special order. So first thing, how common was it back then for the president of the Senate to be doing special orders?
It's very uncommon. I mean, everybody was surprised. I was surprised she did that, right? I guess she expected I was going to stand up and defend myself. Instead, I said nothing. And afterwards, when I went out, the press said, well, you didn't say anything. What do you think? I said, well, I considered the source, right? It didn't have to say anything. People could take it for what it is. And then they interviewed several of the legislators who said basically the same. They were considered the source. Senator Fakes, they were surprised. It's not unusual for lobbyists and legislators to get into shouting matches and arguments. That happens. But I did finally admit at the end, I said, the one thing I will say about Senator Fakes, she was right on one thing. I should have apologized to Larry Houle if he took it the wrong way. That was not the way that a legislator should act. If he took it wrong, I should have apologized to him for it and let it go at that. And I didn't.
The thing that's also interesting to me is I think that in general, I feel like legislators should stand up for other legislators and not for lobbyists. It just seems a little bit weird. I mean, no offense, lobbyists are getting paid a lot of money to advance whoever's paying them's agenda. I mean, I just don't feel like that legislators don't work for lobbyists. They're working for the people of Alaska. I just think the whole idea that, you telling a lobbyist that they can't call you a liar on the record, anyone would be really angry about that. And I just don't understand why the presiding officer in the Senate would say that you owe a lobbyist an apology for him calling you a liar.
Yeah, I'm not sure either. I don't know what relationship she had with Larry or with Frank Turpin, either one. She may have had a long-term relationship with him. I don't know. So I was, as I said, I was surprised that she made that statement. But that was Jan. She would do things like that periodically.
I want to talk about Senate Bill 15. This was your right to strike for teachers. This is another one where I did not know that there was a time when it was against the law for teachers to go on strike. So I guess, and it sounds like this is something that you had known about forever, and you had introduced the bill year after year after year after year before it got any traction. So talk about the need for that bill. And, ultimately, it wasn't the bill itself that got vetoed, but the sunset clause getting vetoed and having to override the governor.
Yeah. Well, as you understand, in collective bargaining, there has to be an even playing field, right? There has to be where each side can get to finality. And that wasn't the case with teachers and school employees. They could negotiate, and pretty quick, the school boards could just implement their proposals. So there was no way to bring finality. They wanted to go to binding arbitration. And that's where I first started out. When I was first elected, they came to me. I guess maybe because of my education background, they came to me and we talked about it. And I was very committed to getting it done. And we finally got it passed in my 15th year, and that's why it was called Senate Bill 15. I went early and said, I want to introduce legislation. I want to make a Senate Bill 15. This is the 15th year I've been after this, and this year I think we're going to get it. Because we had worked on getting some commitments from both sides. The school boards didn't want binding arbitration.
Why were school boards so opposed to binding arbitration? And I learned this from your book. So binding arbitration is basically when two sides are at an impasse, there's a third neutral party that makes the decision that both sides have to accept.
Yep, that's what that is. They just thought it was inappropriate to turn it over to a third party. And of course, I and the teachers were making the argument, look, it's based on the facts. You make your best case, we'll make our best case, and the arbitrator then will decide what should be the outcome, who is right. But they opposed that, and they were very strong. And they said they would never allow anything with binding arbitration to go through. And the teachers, they didn't want to go on strike because they felt that the public then would react negatively to that. Finally, I was able to get the two leaders of the School Board Association and NEA Alaska together and sent them down to my office and said, look, we're going to get it. We're going to get an answer here. We've got to figure out how we can get to finality. We're going to have to make a compromise. And so finally we did. And the compromise was that it wouldn't be binding arbitration. It would be a right to strike when it was finality, but there would be advisory arbitration before they went to the right to strike. So we finally got that bill passed into law in the 15th year. But the only way we got it passed, because there were still some folks who were concerned about it, was to have a sunset provision that said in 2 years, you have to go back and do it again. No one wanted to fight that battle again. So we got a bill passed that removed the sunset provision. That was Senate Bill 16, to remove the sunset provision, and Governor Hickel vetoed it. And his reason for vetoing it, he said, was he didn't think enough time had gone by to see whether or not it was working or not, whether there was a problem. But I was making the argument otherwise, and the teachers were saying, we're happy with this. Let's get this thing permanent in law so we don't have to worry about it again. And so he vetoed it, and it became a real battle. With that type of legislation, it's not an appropriation. It required 2/3. It required 40 votes to override. And so I became, because of my bill, the leader to line up the votes to override. And of course, Governor Hickel had his staff and some legislators on the other side. And it became pretty tense. He would meet with legislators and use strong language with them. And I think I quote Senator Lehman in the book about some of the language that was used. And he was very adamant that his veto should be sustained. And it was right up to the last minute. We weren't sure. I had my chit sheet, I had my commitments, and I had my 40 votes, and I felt comfortable. But when you're that close, you never know for sure. And unfortunately, I had 40 votes, then one who wasn't committed. Unfortunately,
Rick Euling? Was it Rick Euling who was uncommitted?
No, it was the Kenai Senator Republican, Paul Fisher, who was non-committed. And Euling had committed he would vote to override. Unfortunately, on the day of the vote, he didn't show. He didn't appear, and no one could find him. And so I knew that I had to get Senator from Kenai on my side. Met with him, talked with him. NEA did also. And at the last minute, about 15 minutes before floor session, Paul Fisher said, okay, I'll vote to override. And so we went to the floor, and 40 votes, no debate on either side, a quick vote, and it was done. I don't think, Governor Hickel said it's not a big deal, I'm not unhappy, but later actions led me to believe that there was some retribution coming my way, because I had, after that, 3 more of my bills vetoed by him. And I had great respect for Governor Hickel. I think he was, committed. He was usually with good labor, committed to the state, did good as Secretary of the Interior, good businessman. He was just like any politician, right? You have thin skin, and you're going to do what you got to do to win sometimes.
I think that's something that I'm not sure the public appreciates, and I certainly didn't appreciate it before I got into politics, but that is a big consideration, making the governor angry when you have bills that will be going to the governor's desk. I'm not sure that people understand how much hand-wringing you can do about, for example, voting to override or failing to confirm the attorney general. Those sorts of things are going to make the governor angry, and the governor has the veto pen. And there's no question, at least in our case with Governor Dunleavy, vetoing more bills than any other governor in history in this last 2-year period, that a lot of that is, in my humble opinion, because of grievances.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. Early on in my career, I made the decision that I wasn't going to be influenced by being threatened by the governor or being rewarded by the governor, because not only could he threaten vetoes on my bills, but he could say, look, if you'll vote on my side, I'll give you an extra project. I just wasn't going to be one that dealt like that. And very seldom, I don't think I was ever called to the governor's office and sat down and said, look, here's what I can give you. If you stick with me, if you don't, here's what's going to happen. I just made that position clear, and they accepted the fact that I had made my commitments to stick with it. So, but it happens a lot, and it's a reward sometimes it's punishment.
Well, hey, you just mentioned Senator Lauren Lehman and quoting some of the language that Governor Hickel used during this discussion of the veto override. I am chair of House Judiciary, and we have had a lot of elections hearings over the past couple of years. And I just have to say that The only former lieutenant governor who always responds to me and has showed up and testified in my committee hearings is Lauren Lehman. So I am grateful for that. So I want to just say straight up that I am grateful to Lauren Lehman for returning my calls and showing up and testifying when I have asked all former lieutenant governors to testify about elections issues.
Great.
However, what I didn't know and that I learned from your book was about the ban on gay marriage, the ban on same-sex marriage. I didn't know that it was initially a bill proposed by Lyda Green in 1996. And then I did not know that Lauren Lehman was the sponsor of the constitutional amendment in 1998.
Yeah.
You talked about being only one of 3 no votes for Lyda Green's bill in 1996. That is shocking to me that only 3 people voted no on that bill. I guess, can you talk about what it was like in the building when you were having that debate?
Well, it was, pretty tense times. And at that time, by the way, I was doing some other things. I was also doing a statewide race for U.S. Congress. And it was going to be tough enough running against Don Young without getting embroiled in one of those very controversial issues. And so when the constitutional amendment came before the legislature, it became for the Senate, I was advised first, just don't be there.
Right. Johnny Ellis told you not to show up.
Yeah, he told me not to show up. I said, look, Johnny, I appreciate it. You're probably right politically. I've never ducked a vote. I'm not going to start now. Then he said, well, then if you come, don't say anything. And I said, well, I'll think about that. But I knew that was not me either, that I was going to say something. And I did. And
you gave like an 18-minute speech.
About 18-minute speech. I end up by saying, look, I'm not one who's advocating gay marriages, but don't advocate discrimination. And for that reason, I'm going to vote no on a constitutional amendment. Now, it ends up that constitutional amendment passed the voters by about 65, 66%, or maybe a little bit more. And did that hurt me in my congressional race? Well, there's no way you can say for sure, but I was on the opposite side of 66% of voters, and they knew what my position was. It surely didn't help. Right. But I decided that I was going to vote on principle rather than politics and take whatever would be the result.
Well, hey, thank you for your votes.
Yeah.
As someone in a same-sex marriage, I appreciate your votes. So last question I wanted to ask, can you talk a little bit about things that you think the Alaska legislature could change to make them a more efficient, more effective legislative body?
Good question. Difficult answer. Our system wasn't made to be efficient necessarily, right? It wasn't a bicameral system, 2 houses. It wasn't made to be efficient. But I think there are some things we can do. And I think, unfortunately, we've been going backwards in the past at least 10 years, more on the federal level than in Alaska. Because why I say happening in Alaska, even though things have become more strident and rigid on the federal level, where you line up, you're either pro-MAGA or you're anti-MAGA, right? And you know what your outcome is going to be. When people line up that way, there's very little give and take. There's very little room for discussion. But that hasn't been the case in Alaska, and I hope it will continue, because I see that we've had coalition leaderships in both the House and the Senate. And I think that's what people have to keep in mind, that they're elected to do the job. They're elected to make lives better for their constituents. They're not elected to gain power or to benefit themselves. And I think if legislators can remember that and think about that as they get elected, it's real tempting to go for the brass ring, right? To have the power, and everybody has to kowtow to you. But it's much more productive if you're able to sit down, build coalitions, a working group. It may not be a formal coalition, maybe just be a working group, but build those relationships that you can work together. And the bottom line is that's not going to happen unless people trust you, unless they believe that your heart's in the right place and that when you say you're going to do something, you're going to follow through. So I think that's the one thing I could recommend. And I think it's happening, at least from my viewpoint, in the past 3 or 4 years. It's happened in Alaska, and I hope it continues, that we're seeing bipartisan coalitions.
I'll ask a more pointed question. A criticism that has come from a former deputy commissioner of revenue who went on to work for Washington State was that the Alaska finance committees hear too many bills, that in Washington, you don't send a bill to the finance committee if the fiscal note is less than $100,000. And the fact that we have paltry small fiscal notes being sent to the finance committee, slows the finance committee down and has them spending time on things that really shouldn't be their concern. And in some cases, undoing work that the policy committees have already done on the bill. And that it becomes sort of like its own little mini legislative body, that finance gets the last touch on almost every bill that's going to end up going to the floor. And that really they're deciding what happens, and it kind of takes away the meaning of what House Judiciary has done, or what State Affairs has done, or what Community and Regional Affairs has done. And I just think that there could be some reforms that we could do, for example, to not send every single bill to the Finance Committee.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. There's a danger that the Finance Committee becomes kind of their own separate legislative body. And that's the reason why it's been that way for years, why I said early on in my career, where I want to be is I want to be on the Finance Committee, because I know that everything is going to end up there. And we're going to have the final say one way or the other on those bills. The danger is, as you're saying, all of a sudden you got all those bills going there, and they go beyond just looking at the monetary impact, and they look at the policy of the bill. And that policy is to be decided, should have been decided in judiciary or state affairs or resources or somewhere along the line. And what is happening is many legislators are saying, well, instead of going to finance, so let's get it out of these early committees. We'll line up our votes in finance. We'll change the policy there. That's the danger. That's what's happening. And clearly, there's got to be a sign-off on the fiscal notes someplace, but the finance committees could sign off on those fiscal notes, or as you're saying, give it a threshold saying anything X dollars.
Well, I mean, I just think at the very least, we should do an adjustment. And right now, I think it's if a fiscal note of $10,000 or more, it gets a finance referral, and that is absurd.
Yeah. But what happens is many people can really understand small numbers better than they understand the larger numbers, right? So they get themselves involved fighting over those very small numbers, which they lose the real perspective, right, of what this is all about.
We've had an hour-long debate on the House floor about somebody talking about a $1,000 amendment. Like we have done some of the most insane things and wastes of our time when you're thinking about like a multi-billion-dollar budget.
Yeah, no, I know that's what happens. So it's just tough to make that reform because people become used to it. But clearly, I think you're right. And it happened when I was there, and it's still happening today, that the Finance Committee is getting involved in policy areas where it's really, they should be looking at the financial impacts, and approving that.
Well, hey, I don't serve on Finance Committee. And so my perspective is, well, we need to change the way Finance Committee works, and we need to make it not be a mini legislature in and of itself. However, another way is for me to accept the things I cannot change and just decide that I need to serve on finance.
Yeah, that's the other way to do it. And you might find that you really enjoy it and like it. I'm sure you would.
Jim Duncan, thank you so much for being on the podcast today. Thank you so much for writing the book. And thank you so much for your lifelong service to Alaska.
Oh, well, you're welcome. Thank you, Andrew, for having me on. And good luck as things move forward.
Hey, have fun in Phoenix, and good talking to you.
All right, Brian.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot for having me on.
Bye. Thank you, listeners. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, rate, and review us. To contact me, email rep.andrew.gray@aklight.gov or call 907-269-0123.